Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Good to see you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, I trust you had a nice Thanksgiving.
Absolutely. We're actually in a new home. I know that you know that. And this was our first Thanksgiving in our new home. We had a whole bunch of friends to share it with us. We had a big turkey, a ham, all the dressings and side dishes, and we had a great time.
That sounds awesome. So I take it there was 2 turkeys in your house then? The one you ate and you?
Now, here, viewers and listeners, do you see what I have to put up with? This has been for years. I am so impressed by my tolerance, patience, and self-control. This is almost beyond human endurance, but I'm just that kind of guy.
All right, Richard, let's return to our theme, your theme, really, of your favorite books. And I thought we would cover now Henry Hazlitt, an economist that has been a major influence on your life and my life and the lives of many libertarians. And when I think of Henry Hazlitt, I think of his remarkable and marvelous book, Economics in One Lesson. I mean, I've often told people over the years, if you read Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, you will know more economics than probably 95% of the economics professors across the country. I mean, it's just the excellent book that explains to people in very easy, readable terms the real fundamental principles of economics. None of this jargon and complex stuff and charts and graphs. He explains it in terms of really libertarianism, which is talking about real people acting in a real world. So why don't you give us your synopsis of Hazlitt and why you consider him one of your favorite authors?
Well, just to begin with, to sort of first supplement just what you've said, why does he have the significance? He wrote an extremely readable, commonsensical, approachable little book about the principles and policy issues of economics called Economics in One Lesson. But what else particularly makes him notable? Well, let me give the thumbnail biography and intellectual importance. He lived to almost 100 years old. He was born in 1894 and he died in 1993. He served in the U.S. military in the First World War, had wanted to go to college but never finished because he had to drop out to help with the family finances with his widowed mother. But he ended up first going to work for the Wall Street Journal shortly after the First World War, and then moving on to serving as a literary editor, a book review editor, a general writer, and while doing this, he became deeply interested in economics. His first introduction to economics was a book by a famous British economist named Philip Wicksteed called The Common Sense of Political Economy. He may not be a well-known name today, but at the beginning of the 20th century, Wicksteed was an unbelievably clear and lucid writer on the basic core principles of economics and their application. That was a major influence on Henry Hazlitt. Then he started writing for a number of other publications, including, interestingly, the Left of Center Nation magazine. The Nation had hired him in 1930 as their book review editor and literary analyst. But now with the coming of the Great Depression, he was also contributing articles on what had caused the Depression, how to get out of the Depression, and was having debates, literal like article by individual X responded to by Hazlitt or rebutted by the other person with Hazlitt's response on what was causing the Great Depression, what was the role of government. And the consequences, he already before even the New Deal, that is under Herbert Hoover, was making these great arguments in these Nation articles on why the government was the cause of the Great Depression and preventing the recovery. Well, he finally separated ways with the Nation magazine in 1933, briefly served as the editor of the American Mercury when H.L. Mencken stepped down. But in 1934, got the job as the senior financial and economic columnist and writer for the New York Times. And as a consequence, from 1934 to 1945, he wrote a signed column, but all the unsigned editorials on the opinion page, analyzing and explaining economic theory and economic policies from within the constraints in which he had to operate, fairly free market views. But he had a parting of the way with the New York Times in 1944 and 45 because he disapproved of the wartime arrangements for a post-war monetary world. That is the Bretton Woods Agreement, the World Trade Organization, and so on. And as a consequence of this, he had to step down from the New York Times. But in 1946, he leaped to Newsweek magazine. And for the next 20 years, from 1946 to 1966, he had a weekly column in Newsweek magazine called Business Times that were classic analyses of the shortcomings of government policy, the dangers of inflation, the reasons behind budget deficits, and the need for deregulation and free market policies, and returning to a sound monetary system like the gold standard. These have been collected together in one volume. All of his 20 years of Newsweek columns can be downloaded from the Ludwig von Mises Institute site. But you read them today, and like the Economics in One Lesson, they are timely. They sort of still speak to us because, unfortunately, government, though some particulars may change, the core template of the bad types of government policies continue today. I also should mention just to say a few more words about this, Jacob. He came to know Leonard Reed, the founder of the Foundation for Economic Education in the 1940s. And as a consequence, when Reed set up FEE in the spring of 1946, Henry Hazlitt was among the founding board members and remained so for many years, supporting Reed and the espousal of these ideas. In fact, he, along with Frank Charteroff and a woman named Susan La Follette, revived a magazine called The Freeman in the first half of the 1950s. It was a bi-weekly magazine of opinion and news from a classical liberal, libertarian, constitutional conservative point of view, which then they sold for, I believe, like $1 to Leonard Reed in 1956. And that became the well-known fee publication, The Freeman, for decades after that. He continued when he stepped down from Newsweek. He then wrote for at least another 10 or 15 years a weekly column, syndicated column for the Los Angeles Times, which appeared nationwide again. Now, again, one more thing here. Besides the Economics in One Lesson, he wrote many other books on this. Among them that are noteworthy, The Failure of the New Economics. This came out in 1959. What he does is he takes John Maynard Keynes' famous book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, and does a chapter-by-chapter explanation of what Keynes was saying in that chapter, and then a critique of the economic fallacies and errors in Keynes' argument, chapter by chapter. So it's like a chapter-by-chapter commentary that is unbelievably comprehensive and detailed. And then to accompany that, he edited a collection of essays by anti-Keynesians called The Critics of Keynesian Economics by other authors as a complement to that. He wrote a great book called The Foundations of Morality, explaining from a utilitarian point of view the conceptions of a free society, individual liberty, the importance of markets, and the notion of ethics that an individual should follow for his own satisfaction and long-run well-being. Now, just again to mention others, writing all these articles over many years, he often collected and edited them into books. Everything you ever wanted to know about inflation, man versus the welfare state, the conquest of poverty, to just name a few of these. The result is that it is not wrong to say that from the 1940s until he really stopped writing only at really an advanced age, practically in his 90s, Henry Hazlitt was one of the most prominent, most widely known, most respected voices for free market economics in the popular press. To give one indication, when he retired from his Newsweek column in 1966, that Business Tides column was continued, but they hired 3 people to then write articles in replacing of him. Paul Samuelson, the famous Keynesian, Henry Wallach, a sort of middle-of-the-road economist, and Milton Friedman. And Milton Friedman at the time said that he thought it was noteworthy that to replace one Henry Hazlitt, they needed to hire 3 alternative economists. And so I would just mention one other thing on a personal note, if I may, before I say a few words about economics in one lesson again. I had the opportunity to meet Henry Hazlitt. It was in the 1980s. I was doing my graduate studies in New York, and I was writing articles and reviews regularly for a magazine called Libertarian Review, then edited by a now unfortunately forgotten person named Royal Childs, who was a brilliant writer on a wide variety of policy and historical themes from a libertarian perspective. But he arranged for myself and a friend of mine who also was in graduate school, is now deceased, Don Lavoie, to go up to Wilton, Connecticut to interview Henry Hazlitt at his home.
Wow.
And Don Lavoie and I, and it got published in an edited version in then a later issue of Libertarian Review. But we drove up there in sort of the mid-morning, and we literally spent the entire day with Henry Hazlitt and his wife Frances at their beautiful home in Wilton, Connecticut. Graciously, his wife prepared a delightful lunch. He told us about his life history, his work as a columnist, as an economic commentator, his views on Keynesianism, the dangers of the political situation at that time, what he saw as the strengths and weaknesses of the then growing free market ideas again, and then to top it off, he then took Don Lavoie and me out to one of the nicest restaurants in that part of Connecticut at his own expense. It was a delightful day with Henry Hazlitt. I met him a few other times, and I can only say that he was approachable, he was clear, he was friendly, and he was just a delightful human being. Now, just to finish this without going too on like a monologue here, what you said at the beginning, Economics in One Lesson came out in 1946. It was meant to be a popularization and an extension and elaboration of the ideas in Frederick Bastiat's book on what is seen and what is not seen. That is, that it is easy to see immediate government policies and their impacts, but what is ignored and set aside or missed are the longer run consequences from these short run policies that may not only solve the problem that was hoped for, but it may in fact make that situation even worse. And this book has been in dozens of languages now. It has remained in print, and he talks about all of the public policy issues that still dominate us today. But if I can just add one other thing. Where did he get the name Economics in One Lesson for the title? Well, I actually found out where. This is a pamphlet from the late 19th century. And if you can see the title, it's called Political Economy in One Lesson. And it was written by a French economist and translated by the Cobden Society, named after Richard Cobden, the Cobden Society in London. And put out this little pamphlet. But that seems to be the way that Henry Hazlitt got the title of Economics in One Lesson. He cribbed from a Frenchman. I guess that's okay.
That's fascinating. You know, what is also fascinating is that here is a libertarian, and Hazlitt was hardcore, that is writing for mainstream publications like the New York Times and Newsweek. I mean, it's just shocking, because I don't think you'd ever see that today. and this was in the heyday of Keynesianism. I mean, the 30s and the 40s, and it was this tidal wave of statism that was flooding across the world and the United States, as reflected by Roosevelt's New Deal and the garrison state that was coming into existence in the 40s and 50s. And yet here this libertarianism, this libertarian is writing these columns in these mainstream publications like the New York Times and Newsweek, which is absolutely fascinating. All right, so what's that? Is that the book?
Economics in One Lesson.
All right. Yeah, I mean, it's an absolutely fantastic book. When I discovered it early on, and when I discovered libertarianism, I mean, it assisted the scales to drop from my eyes, because it made things so clear, and it's written sort of in the spirit of Frederick Bastiat, who also had such an influence on us. Okay, so what do you have there?
This is my autographed copy, Jacob. My autographed copy from the first time I met Henry Hazlitt.
That is really nice.
I value this greatly.
Yeah, that is really nice. All right, well, you told us about Hazlitt's relationship with Leonard Reed and Fee. What about Mises and Hayek? I mean, we've talked about Mises and Hayek.
Yeah, that's interesting too. Hazlitt's first sort of discovery of Mises came in the mid-1930s. Mises's famous book on socialism had been written in German in 1922, had gone through a revised edition in the early 1930s in German, but then in 1936, the book was translated into English, originally in a British edition. And Hazlitt had somehow gotten a copy of that British edition, and then on the pages of the New York Times, in like the Sunday book review section of the New York Times, did this big article on socialism, on Mises's book on socialism, calling it the greatest book on these themes since John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty.
Wow.
He communicated a bit with Mises, if I recall, the old-fashioned correspondence. But according to Hazlitt, as he told the story, it's 1940. Okay, it's 1940. It's in the summer of 1940, and he's in his office at that times, the New York Times, and the phone rings, and he picks up the phone and he says, "Hello," and at the other end, the voice says in a very thick German accent, "Ludwig Mises here." Mises had like just recently arrived in America from war-torn Europe, and as Hazlitt said, it was like hearing over the phone someone saying, "Adam Smith here, John Stuart Mill here." Now, they became fast friends. In fact, Margit Mises recounts this in her own book, My Years with Ludwig von Mises, and Hazlitt emphasized it as well in conversation when we had that interview with him, that for years, whether he was working at the New York Times or then at Newsweek, he and Mises would talk on the phone about what the government was doing and the policy errors and everything, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day on the telephone. They were unbelievably close and dear friends. In fact, if I can just tell one other story about this, Mises and his wife Margit had come to the United States in the summer of 1940. But Margit, his wife Margit had been married before, and she had a son and a daughter from her first marriage. Guido, who was in London, he was going to school in London, and her daughter Gita, who had been in a finishing school in Switzerland, but got tired of the school and ran away to Paris. And she got caught in Paris when the Germans invaded France. So Mises and Margit get to America, but they don't know what's happened to Gita. Well, to make a long story short, Gita escaped from France, but she was working with the French underground, and the Gestapo found out. And a German officer who was her friend said, "You better get out of town, like now, walk, leave, or otherwise you're going to have visitors tonight. And she got across the Pyrenees to Spain. She contacted her mother, and Mises paid for the train to Lisbon, Portugal, and a ticket for a ship. But it was Henry Hazlitt, who knew various people, who arranged the visa for Mises' stepdaughter to make it into the United States. That's the type of the closeness and friendship that they had, Jacob. So they were very close. Now, in the case of Hayek, the same thing happened again, but in the following way: is that Hayek's Road to Serfdom was published in the spring of 1944, and once more in the New York Times, Henry Hazlitt wrote this in the Sunday Book Review section, this huge lead page about the road to serfdom and its importance to understand the problems of the era in which humanity was passing. That got a lot of publicity. In fact, so much publicity that it was then picked up by Reader's Digest. And Reader's Digest magazine, I don't know if they still do it, but they used to take books and do like condensed versions of them to put in as a supplement in an issue of the old Reader's Digest. And in fact, Hayek, when he saw the digested, edited version, he said himself that the Reader's Digest had edited down even better than he could have done himself to keep the essentials of his argument. And that meant that the Road to Serfdom, going out as this Reader's Digest supplement, was read by hundreds of thousands of people in the United States. It basically helped make the Road to Serfdom a bestseller. Henry Hazlitt assisted in doing that. And then as a consequence, when Hayek helped arrange the first meeting in April of 1947 of the famous Mont Pelerin Society, an organization of classical liberal and free market economists, journalists, businessmen, Henry Hazlitt, of course, was a prominent founder of the organization, there with Hayek and Mises in that first meeting in Switzerland. So there was this intellectual synergy and complement and support that Hazlitt showed for these two individuals who he considered to be leading voices for liberty in those dark decades of the 20th century.
Yeah, in fact, when I recommend books for people that are just discovering libertarianism and libertarian economics, is I'll recommend that book that we've mentioned earlier when we were talking about Ludwig von Mises, Economic Policy, which was a series of lectures that he delivered in Argentina. Because even though it was written many years ago, and these lectures were delivered maybe in the 50s or 60s, that they're still timeless, as you say. You can read them and understand inflation and the welfare state and so forth. And then there's Economics in One Lesson by Hazlitt. That's always my second recommendation. And then there's The Road to Serfdom by Hayek. And then, of course, all of Leonard Reed's books. It's interesting that these giants of libertarianism all got together. I mean, I guess that's natural. But, what's one of the interesting aspects of this is that Mises ends up at New York University. I assume that Hazlitt was living there in New York?
Yes. Well, he was living in Connecticut, but both when he was at the New York Times and then switching over to Newsweek, he was, I assume, practically every day in an office that he had in their office buildings in New York.
All right. Well, so Mises gets sort of treated pretty badly. I mean, he's given a visiting slot there at NYU, which was nice, but as I understand it, he was being funded by outside sources, that they wouldn't pay him a salary there, and of course he was giving this radical, pure case for libertarianism, essentially from an economic perspective, which wasn't very popular back then. But yet here you have Hazlitt that is very successful with respect to getting a position at the New York Times, at Newsweek. Right. How do you explain the difference here? Is there an explanation for it?
That is one of the anomalies. In fact, first of all, the first problem that Mises had was his age. He came to the United States when he was in his 60s. That's a time when most people are thinking about finishing a career and retiring. So there was the age problem about a position for him. There was also the fact that he wanted to stay in New York. There were teaching positions for him that could have been his in other places in the United States that a former Vienna student of his, Fritz Machlup, had been working hard to try to arrange. He would arrange for Mises to have visiting guest lectures, which would be sort of like an interview to introduce Mises to the faculty of some university or college somewhere. But it would have required Mises to live outside of New York, and he viewed that this was the intellectual capital of the America. He didn't want to be in it. And the problem was that it was difficult to get him a position in New York. Many refugee scholars had either temporary or even a few of them permanent positions at the New School for Social Research, located in southern Manhattan near Washington Square. But the problem is the New School of Social Research was very left of center. In fact, I can tell you a story about that. I think it was Henry Hazlitt that told me this. Henry Hazlitt had contacted one of the prominent administrators at the New School for Social Research and said, you know, there's this wartime refugee that has just arrived in the United States. And he's very well known in Europe. He's a respected scholar. But, you know, it's cost him a lot to get here using his savings, and, you know, he really could use a job. And I know you give a lot of helping hands to refugee scholars, at least an initial stepping stone of having a position, a salary. And the fellow said, well, who is he? And he said, well, his name is Ludwig von Mises. And the New School of researchers said, well, let me get back and I'll talk to a few people. I'll get back to you. And he did get back to Hazlitt. He says, we don't have a position for him. The reason being is that I spoke to some of the people on the faculty, and he would be too out of step with his reactionary ideas. Now there's an irony in this, Jacob, if I can tell one more story along these lines. In 1933 and 34, the new Nazi regime in Germany was expelling professors from the universities of Germany. Not just Jews, that was bad enough, but anyone that they viewed as a critic or unreliable. So now you have this growing number of first German scholars who had no place to go and couldn't really stay in Germany any longer. So according to both the British economist Lionel Robbins and William Beveridge, who is the English person who helped design the British welfare state during World War II, both Beveridge and Lionel Robbins were by coincidence in Vienna. And they're sitting in a Vienna cafe. And Mises comes into the cafe holding a copy of today's newspaper, that day's newspaper. And he says, look at the headlines. The Nazis are starting to expel professors from the universities. Something has to be done to help them. And they brainstormed there. And the brainstorm resulted in a network of universities, first in Britain and then the United States, who would serve as entrees for scholars who had to leave Germany and needed a helping hand for a first teaching position to establish their reputation either in Britain or the United States, and to be honest, to have a salary to live on. So here is the irony. Mises is sitting there helping to brainstorm the founding of an organization to help refugee scholars escaping from Nazi tyranny. Yet when he himself needs that hand, he's given a slap across the face. It's one of the scandals of that era, in my opinion, in the sense of the refugee scholars. So what happened was that in his first years in the United States, Mises lived on grants from the Rockefeller Foundation, which enabled him through the National Bureau of Economic Research to have a research position in which he wrote monographs, gave speeches, worked on his books during the war, Bureaucracy, Omnipotent Government. But then his friends finally were able to arrange this visiting professorship in the Graduate School of Business Administration at NYU, partly because at that time another friend of Mises's, Lawrence Fertig, who was a well-known columnist for, I believe it was the New York Sun or the New York Tribune, a regular free market columnist, was either on the New York Board of Trustees or knew a board member. And as a consequence, Fertig and Henry Hazlitt pushed hard to get Mises at least this visiting position. Now, if there is a Guinness Book of Records category for visiting professorships, Mises would have to have the longest-term visiting professorship in human history, according to the Guinness Book. Because from 1945 until he finally retired from teaching in 1969 at the advanced age of over 90, he was a visiting professor at NYU every semester teaching a seminar. And I'll just make one other point about Hazlitt. So Mises retires he's around 90 years old. He's getting frail. He's forgetting things, if I can put it politely. And he doesn't have a lot of income. So how is he and his wife Margaret going to get by? Well, Henry Hazlitt got together with Leonard Reed, and each of them personally made a donation, their own donation, to FEE as private individuals. Right? Leonard Reed, the founder, Henry Hazlitt, a board member, they are giving donations to FEE. And that's to basically pay a salary to Mises. And what Leonard Reed would do, he would write little notes to Mises with a check inside, because he didn't want to embarrass Mises that he's getting charity. Okay? Mm-hmm. What would happen? Oh, we forgot that we had not paid you for these series of articles you wrote. Or we went through our records and there was this lecture you gave for which we hadn't sent you your honorarium. Okay?
That's great.
They helped him survive in that way. Now, how did I find out about this? Well, I had the honor and privilege for 5 years to be the president of the Foundation for Economic Education from 2003 to 2008, when they were still housed in their mansion in Irvington-on-Hudson in New York. And I was going through archives in my spare time. I wanted to know more about the history of FEE, Leonard Reed, everything that went on, Mises's connection with FEE. And it was in those archives that I found out this story of how Leonard Reed and Henry Hazlitt, basically out of their own pocket and some money from a few others. That would be unfair just to say them. In fact, I believe that Pierre Goodrich, who founded the Liberty Fund, and maybe Charles Koch, but I know for sure maybe Goodrich, but the bulk of it from Leonard Reed and Henry Hazlitt to basically help Mises financially get by in his last years.
That's awesome. That is really an awesome story. One last question, Richard. You mentioned that that Henry Hazlitt's essays in Newsweek, or people can access them at
Yes.
Mises.org. What about
Yes.
his New York Times columns? Have those ever been reprinted?
Yes, and I think the Mises Institute may have either all or a selection of those available on their site as well. And of course, there was a slight difference between the Newsweek columns and the New York Times columns. Obviously, with a signed column, he could be more himself, if you will. But when he had to do the unsigned editorials, he had to say what he thought was true, but in the confines of what was considered the general editorial outlook of the New York Times. With the Newsweek column, he was paid to just give his informed judgment of analyzing the economic policy issues of the day. And, often conservatives look back on the Eisenhower years, from the time Eisenhower became president after the 1952 election to 1960. The good Eisenhower years. Well, compared to some other presidents in terms of government spending and policy, he obviously was better. But if you read Hazlitt's columns during the Eisenhower years, spending, taxing, regulating, crony capitalism, unending misguided judgments about what the government should be doing within the Eisenhower administration. So it's revealing on how a free market economist viewed what, in retrospect, many conservatives considered to be a better presidency in the post-World War II period.
That's really interesting. All right, for those of you that are just getting exposed to libertarianism for the first time, seeing this video, take a look at people like Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek, and especially this book, Economics in One Lesson, that, like I say, you'll learn more about economics than you'll ever learn in an economics class. But Richard, most important, it brings economics to life. I mean, it makes it interesting as compared to sitting in an economics class in most colleges that are sitting up there droning on about these charts and graphs and demand curves and supply curves and so forth. Libertarianism brings economics to life because it's talking about how real people act and behave in a real world environment where they're trading goods and services or traveling, they're interacting with people, and it makes it much more vibrant.
It is absolutely true. And if you have a friend or a relative who you would like to introduce some of these ideas to, but you don't know what to give them to read because that book is too fat, that one sounds too esoteric. But if you really want to give someone a short book, it's not very thick, with short chapters but poignant, direct, clear, no waffling around, but is extremely readable and commonsensical. There is no other better one to begin someone with than Economics in One Lesson. I cannot recommend it too highly. It would be a great Christmas gift to anyone who you want to introduce these ideas to.
All right. Well, now, speaking of Christmas gifts, let me take this opportunity to tell you all that we have a new Christmas gift for you to give to people. We're absolutely excited about it. We're getting them in. Whoa. We're getting them in today. It's a brand new book published by the Future of Freedom Foundation. We don't have the book yet, but this is what it looks like. Can you see it there, Richard?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. It's a
Daily
book.
Quotations on Liberty from Freedom Daily.
Yeah, it's a daily quotation book that for 365 or 366 days for leap year, which a daily quote. We've pulled out the best quotes that we've compiled over the years, and we've put them into a calendar book that is called Freedom Daily, which many of our long-term supporters will know was the original label name for our monthly journal. And so this is going to make a great Christmas gift. We're already getting lots of orders. If you join our FFF Freedom Club, because this is end of year fundraising time, and we certainly hope you'll support our work with a generous donation. If you join the Freedom Club, which is a $250 donation, you get an autographed copy of Freedom Daily. But it's running for $19.95, so buy a copy for yourself, treat yourself to a Christmas present, or we're also getting a lot of orders to give this as a gift to other people. So it's a great thing. You're able to live with these great writers and authors every day of the year. Great way to start the day with a daily quotation. All right.
Yeah, if I can just add one more thing to that, Jacob. I've known Jacob Hornberger now since 1984, when I first moved to Dallas, Texas. And he has been a dedicated and principled voice for these ideas, like very few that I've ever known. And he has been operating this organization, the Future of Freedom Foundation, since 1989-1990. I had the privilege to be the vice president of the organization for many years and contributing regular articles to the monthly publication. There is no more dedicated, there is no more principled, there is no more honorable individual than Jacob G. Hornberger. Please help the Future of Freedom Foundation to continue its work, because this voice has been important for 30 years now, and it needs to continue. And every dollar, no matter how modest the contribution, helps advance liberty in an avenue in which compromise is never made.
Yeah, Richard, it means a lot to hear those words from you, because you and I do go back a long ways. And when I started FFF, as you'll recall, it was a tough journey. We were starting from scratch, and you were the vice president, writing an article for us every day and advising me on, how we should do different things. And it's been a struggle for 29 years or so, but what a labor of love. I mean, how many people can honestly say that they absolutely love what they do in life, go to work every day? I can't wait to go to work every day, and it's been fantastic, and it's been fantastic working with you, and thank you for the great contributions you've done for this organization. We're very grateful. All right, on that note, we'll wrap things up. Richard, I greatly enjoyed the fascinating conversation, and look forward to talking to you next week, and thank you all for tuning in, and thank you for your support and for considering supporting us for the coming year.